witch trials from beginning to end. 150 were accused at that time. At the conclusion, we have a second exhibit, which is called Witches of All Exceptions. We talk about the word witch, and we also explain the witch hunt to you. This, most likely it will be this door will open. If not, the other exit will open and you'll be guided. This is going to go around in a circle, all the way around. I hope you enjoy it. Sit where you're comfortable. If you want to sit over there and have it there, but I'm a little worried about this because it's rough and I just don't want her to might get a little splinters, so don't ever touch that, okay? But you can sit over here, wherever you like. How's that, guys?
Thank
you
you
so much.
Yep.
I hope you enjoyed both our presentations and your visit to Salem. She's so quiet.
Oh, yeah.
Wait, what?
Sometimes you just forget sweetness.
You're gonna hear a little loud music shortly.
Welcome to the famous Salem Witch Museum. We are going to show you the witchcraft trials which took place in Salem Village in 1692. Do you believe in witches? Millions of your ancestors did. Worship of the powers of evil, of the forces behind storm and sickness and drought and death was man's first religion, and the witch was its priestess. Long after Christianity had come, it survived in secret. On the witches' Sabbath, the covens of 13 would gather round their magic 9-foot circle. A fire would be lit beneath the cauldron. The scourge and pentacle and asame, a black-handled sacrificial knife would appear, and the ancient ritual invoking the evil would begin. To the good folk of Salem, 1692, the devil and witchcraft were realities. They could hear him in the howling of wolves, in the creaking of an old house on a winter's night. They lived in dread of the Indians, of diseases such as smallpox, which killed their children without reason, of the home government in England even, which had threatened to take away their lands and their charter. Fear was the climate of their lives. And for hours every Sunday, their ministers warned them against the devil, the Prince of Darkness, who was everywhere, who whispered evil thoughts into the minds of the unguarded, tempting them to sign his book, to sell their souls for power and riches in this life. He it was who met with half-mad old women in the forest to perform unspeakable rites, threatened us all with eternal damnation. He had come to New England so creatures like Cotton Mather said to undo God's kingdom, setting snares for the unwary, forever watching, waiting to claim his own. Here is the Putnam House, typical of its day, everything in it plain and practical. People then had little time for play. The men in summer worked at farming or fishing. In winter they mended fences or nets, or went hunting in the woodlands for partridge or wild turkey. The women toiled the year round at cooking, washing, scrubbing and sanding the floors, molding tallow candles to light the long winter nights. For young people, especially girls, there was not much amusement. A girl like little Ann Putnam, having done her household duties, would not be encouraged to run and play, to meet boys, to be frivolous. The Puritan God forbade it. Trapped as they were in this somber adult world, it is not surprising that girls of the time became restless and resentful. But the hand of authority was so heavy upon them, they dared not express themselves, except sometimes in attacks of what we call hysteria, wild, destructive emotional outbursts. Anne had more reason than most for being disturbed. Her mother was an embittered woman whose sister had died in childbirth. Mrs. Putnam herself had had 2 children who had died, and lately had started dreaming about her sister and her own dead babies. It seems that in her distraction, Mrs. Putnam considered turning away from her God and trying to contact the dead by forbidden means. And in this little Anne was to be her helpmate. For Anne was one of a circle of girls who had begun to meet quite regularly in the house of the Reverend Samuel Parris. The center of these meetings was old Tituba, a black woman whom Parris had brought back as his servant from Barbados. To amuse the girls, Tituba told them stories or showed them tricks and scraps of magic, some of which had probably come over with her ancestors in the slave ships from Africa. Anne's mother may have thought to use Tituba as her means of communing with the dead, but things shortly took a very different turn. Poor innocent Tituba. Little did she imagine that the tales she told to pass a winter's afternoon would soon be used against her. Nor could she have guessed that the terrible suspicions at first concentrated upon her would spread to involve so many, many others. The very fact that her circle met in the house of a minister made the girls all the more guilty about what they were doing. From playing at witchcraft, they would come to believe themselves bewitched, and shortly be laying the blame for their condition upon others. An explosion was coming. One of the first to give way was Betty Parris, a frail, suggestible child, the daughter of the Reverend Parris himself. She began to fall into trance-like states, her eyes fixed, her body rigid. The disorder next spread to Abigail Williams, her cousin who lived in the same household. She began to babble or to run around on all fours, making barking or braying noises. When his daughter's condition became frighteningly acute, the Reverend Parris called in Dr. Griggs, a physician in the village. Dr. Griggs was at a loss. His simple medical knowledge told him the girl did not have fever or epilepsy or the usual forms of madness. What did she have? Whatever the malady was, dozens of other young girls would soon be catching it. Within a few days, Dr. Griggs would be making the same calls, asking the same futile questions in houses all over Salem village.
Betty, child, what afflicts thee?
Betty, speak, in God's name. Who has done this to thee?
It began to seem to the villagers that they were seeing the devil's work.
Oh, protect her.
The girls were possessed.
In tongues.
They twitched and spoke in tongues. It was not a case for medicine at all. Said the doctor, the evil hand is upon them. It was for men of the church to discover who was responsible. The girls now began to be questioned night and day, the Reverend Parris himself taking the lead in these inquisitions. The sternest efforts were made to wring from them some hint as to who had bewitched them. It was not an easy task. At first the girls would not answer. They simply screamed and writhed or did blasphemous things such as dashing a Bible against the wall. But gradually they began to give names. Betty Parris, driven frantic by her inquisitors, and probably calling out to her own black nurse for help, sobbed, "Tituba! Oh, Tituba!" And that poor woman became among the first to be accused as a witch. Others, much less likely, named by the maddened girls almost it seemed at random, were also accused. Among them was a woman known all her life for piety and uprightness, but now grown old and ill and almost too deaf to hear the charges against her. Rebecca Nurse. The fact that Rebecca could scarcely walk at the time in no way affected the accusation of witchcraft. The hysterical girls carried away began giving what was called spectral evidence. Visions they claimed to have had of the accused. According to Ann Putnam and Abigail Williams, Rebecca's shape, her astral self or soul, had been seen flying about, while in body she lay at home in bed. At first, no one in the town could believe it. But then her few enemies, among them Ann Putnam's mother, declared against her. On March 23rd, 1692, Rebecca Nurse was placed under arrest. The case was very nearly dismissed, but for a last-minute accusation made once again by Mrs. Putnam. On the strength of that, old Rebecca Nurse was finally brought to trial in Salem on June 29th, Chief Justice William Stoughton presiding. Even then, the townsfolk on the jury were not convinced. Mrs. Putnam and the girls who had testified against Rebecca were among the onlookers. A hush falls over the courtroom as Thomas Fisk, foreman of the jury, rises to deliver the verdict.
May it please the court, we find the defendant, Rebecca Nurse, not guilty.
Mr. Fisk, I must ask that you and your fellow jurors reconsider your verdict.
Rebecca was cross-examined again about a remark she had made earlier in the trial. It involved a misunderstanding which, because of her deafness, she had been unable to clarify to the satisfaction of the court. Now, old and exhausted, she was questioned about it once more, but she was too worn out to defend herself, simply staring into space and making no reply. The jurors recessed once more. Now Thomas Fisk comes forward to deliver the final verdict.
We, the jurors, find Rebecca Nurse guilty.
So the law put itself at the disposal of this gathering madness. Before it was done, 19 would hang. Another, Giles Corey, would die a still more horrible death, and hundreds all over New England would be sent to jail, some for up to 7 years, languishing forgotten, long after the obsession with witchcraft had died away. Amid all this confusion, the farcical trials in which judge and jury gave in to the screaming of hysterical girls, amid fear and slander and random accusations, a few men stood out as heroes, steadfastly clinging to their reason and their principles, even in the shadow of the gallows. One of these was John Proctor. From the first, he refused to be swept up in the general panic. Unlike others, he saw the hounding of witches to be nonsense and said so. When his own servant girl was afflicted, he turned her over his knee and spanked her, temporarily curing her. His outspokenness attracted the attention of the girls. His pregnant wife Elizabeth was soon accused and hailed into court as a witch. When he took the stand to defend her, he was denounced by one of the witnesses, Abigail Williams. By spectral evidence, she suddenly discovered that he too was a witch. And the other girls at once joined in. 52 people signed a petition on his behalf, but it was no use. In August 1692, this brave man and his wife were condemned and sent to jail. John's prophecy was coming true. The girls, he had said, will make devils of us all.
Witch! Witch! Witch!
By the summer of 1692, others all over New England, some 250 in all, had been thrown into prison. The accused sometimes sharing cells with their accusers, witnesses whom the girls had later turned upon and implicated. Rebecca Nurse, even after her ordeal in court, was not let alone. The girls claimed that her soul was escaping and tormenting them still, so the old woman was loaded down with chains, as if these would somehow trap her wandering spirit. She was charged for her chains, just as she and the other prisoners were charged for the food they ate. Even those who escaped hanging were in some cases bankrupted by their terms in prison. Here is Sarah Daston of Charlestown. Her neighbors denounced her as a witch. She was tried and found not guilty, but she was too poor to pay her court costs and so held. Her relatives were years in collecting the money to free her, and before they did so, she died, innocent and all but forgotten, in this cell. Here are John Proctor and his pregnant wife Elizabeth. John is writing a last letter to the friends who had tried to save him. In defending his wife and their unborn child, he has at least succeeded. Because of her pregnancy, the court will grant her a stay of execution, and she will be released after the witch madness has died down. John is less fortunate. He will hang within the fortnight on August 19th, along with George Burroughs and 3 others as guiltless as himself. And here is Tituba, the old slave, whose charms and tricks and tales told to pass a winter's afternoon were the start of it all. In fear of her insane masters, she has confessed and will eventually go free, never understanding what wrong she has done. Indeed, she did none, nor did any of the others. They were simply struck down by the dementia of their times, the way in ages to come men were to be struck down for holding the wrong political opinions, or for being of the wrong race. It is perhaps no accident that the Salem witch persecution began with a woman who was black, and that the devil himself at these trials was often referred to as the Black Man. Of all the 20 executed, the most piteous and stubbornly brave was Giles Corey. He was not blameless. He had believed in witches and even testified against his own wife. He was then accused himself. Under the law of those days, as he knew, to be a confessed witch meant to forfeit one's lands and one's fortune. Giles Corey determined to protect his heirs by never uttering a word in court. He was therefore condemned to the medieval torture of pressing, in which heavier and heavier weights were piled upon a man's chest until he either confessed or was crushed to death when his rib cage collapsed. Corey, a man of enormous strength, never gave in to his tormentors.
Giles Corey, wilt thou not speak and say yea or nay in thy behalf? What sayest thou? Speak!
Wait! Wait!
So be it then. Oh, wait.
Others were more fortunate. They merely went to Gallows Hill. Among these was the Reverend George Burroughs, who was hanged on the same day as John Proctor. Burroughs, a former minister in Salem Village, had been arrested and brought back from Maine. His execution was presided over by Cotton Mather, who had come from Boston for the occasion. It was thought in those days that a witch could not recite the Lord's Prayer without a mistake. On the gallows, Burroughs gave this final proof of his innocence.
And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Things had gone too far. Cotton Mather speaks.
This man is guilty and shall hang. There shall be no reversals of justice in this place. Hangman, you may proceed.
So died George Burroughs, minister of the Lord, and 18 others in 1692, accused of witchcraft by enemies, superstitious neighbors, young girls in the grip of a vengeful hysteria. Once the witch mania had passed, it never came again to New England, and at its worst was never as bad as in Europe, where it is said millions were hanged or burned on suspicion of having made a compact with the devil. One might have asked then, and could still ask today, who is the devil? On whose side was he fighting? On whose side does he fight even now? Before the trials were over, one of the afflicted girls admitted that what she had done was done for sport. Later, other girls confessed, among them Anne Putnam, whose evil genius was perhaps as much her mother's as her own. Years afterward, in 1706, on the anniversary of a fast which the state of Massachusetts had declared in repentance for the Salem witch trials, Anne tried to make atonement for the terrible evil she had done. As she stood in her pew, Parson Joseph Green read her statement to the congregation, among whom sat the children of Rebecca Nurse.
I, Anne Putnam, desire to be humbled before God. It was a great delusion of Satan. I did it not out of any anger, malice, or ill will. And particularly, as I was a chief instrument of accusing good wife Nurse and her two sisters, I desire to lie in the dust and be humbled for it. I desire to lie in the dust and earnestly beg forgiveness of all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow.
So it all ended. We may take pride in the fact that in a world such as that of the 17th century, haunted by superstition, by dreams of magic and satanic evil, we gave way but once, and then only briefly, to our fears.